What I've wanted is to sort of reel people in to the science of language with charming and curious examples. And I think my book contains a lot of that. And what it says to me is that there's a real hunger and an appetite for learning about language, but people don't necessarily know where to go.
Welcome to Books and Ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and on this podcast, I talk with interesting people from a wide variety of fields. Today, my guest is David Shariatmadari, author of the fascinating new book, Don't Believe a Word, The Surprising Truth About Language. David is a journalist who happens to have a degree in linguistics. In this book, he shares his passion for the field and also debunks some of the most common myths. If you are a fan of my other podcast, Brain Science, you might consider this episode almost a continuation of my recent interview with Cecilia Heyes, because we will be further debunking the idea that language is an instinct. Please stay tuned after the interview for a few brief announcements. Thanks for being on the show with me today, David. Would you mind pronouncing your name for me?
Sure, and thanks for having me, Ginger. I pronounce my name David Shariatmadari.
So that must be how you got interested in linguistics.
Well, yeah, that's a connection well made. My background is that my father was from Iran. He emigrated from Iran to Great Britain in 1968. And my mother's English. And she's a native English speaker. My father is a native Farsi speaker. So this is how I have this weird combination of a Western first name and an Iranian last name. But, you know, having that sense of a different culture in my family background, in my heritage, and a different language really is what got me intrigued by language and ultimately led me to linguistics. There's no doubt about that.
And what kind of work are you doing now?
At the moment, I'm an editor at The Guardian in London. So I'm a newspaper editor. I edit the opinion section. So I'm a journalist and I'm an amateur linguist and an author, basically.
I really hate it that The Guardian shut down their science blogs.
Yeah, that's too bad. But we still have science writers writing for us, and we've got a great science team.
Yeah, and that's more than most U.S. publications can say anymore, that's for sure. Before we talk, really, you told me a little bit about you. You want to give us an overview of the book?
Yeah, so the book, I sort of conceived of the book as an introduction to linguistics, but an introduction that would be kind of not easy exactly, but would be kind of without teeth. You know, it would be something that people would be able to get into if they just have a passing curiosity about language, or they've always kind of wondered how it works. I felt like an appealing way to do this would be to deal with language myths, because a lot of the sort of folk knowledge that gets passed around about language is erroneous, and kind of linguistics has got to the stage where our knowledge of, you know, why language changes or where words come from or how languages are related is way beyond the kind of common understanding. And I wanted to sort of, so it's a kind of primer, a linguistics primer, but with a sort of friendly face, really. And I've tried to pack in lots of interesting, juicy tidbits about language of the kind that appeal to people, right? So there are linguistic memes out there. People love to swap etymologies, word origins, and tell each other about how a phrase or a word evolved, and talk about dialects and that kind of thing. So I'm trying to hook into that interest, give people plenty of that in the book, but also give them an introduction to the slightly heavier sides, the sciencier sides, the more complex philosophical debates. But as I say, hopefully in a way that doesn't come off as intimidating.
Right. It was a very unique approach, and I think a great idea, given that linguistics tends to be a little off-putting because it's so technical. Since the chapters of your book are fairly independent, I'm going to actually start out by asking you to talk about the last chapter, because that's the one that happens to interest me the most, which is the myth that language is an instinct. And I have to start out by admitting that I have a long-standing bias against Chomsky's account, mainly because he never seems to take the evidence from neuroscience into account. So what I'd like you to do is, if you don't mind, is take us through Chomsky's account of language and then explain, why it does appear to be losing favor now, even among linguists.
Well, first of all, there have always been dissenters to Chomsky's view. But I think what happened in the second half of the 20th century is that he became the kind of hegemonic view that university departments tended to follow. Basically, his view of language is that there is a discrete language module in the brain, which is sort of primed to pick out data from the environment and then kind of grow subsequently along preordained lines. So his kind of enterprise, or his approach to language, started out with an attempt to explain or identify the commonalities between languages, commonalities in structure, because he thought that that would reveal the character of this discrete language module in the brain. So his idea was that if you get lots of data from lots of different languages, and if you identify the structures that they have in common, then you're getting something like the shape of the linguistic blueprint in the brain that we're all born with. That was his endeavor, basically, was to identify or to delineate that blueprint. And it's called the innateness hypothesis because he believed that there was this innate component. And that is why, he will say, well, a baby is an environment where there's like all these inputs and lots of data coming in. And how is it that the baby manages to select just the linguistic data and deem that worthy of its attention and worthy of its analysis? And there was also a concept called the poverty of the stimulus, which is the idea that a growing child doesn't get enough data from its environment, from its caregivers, to explain the rapidity with which their sort of speech faculty grows. There was a sense that this sort of astonishing progress that children make could not be explained by the amount of examples they were being given of words and sentences. So immediately there's an appeal to something else. There's an appeal to a missing part of that puzzle, which Chomsky believed and believes resides in the brain and is innate.
So does this poverty of stimulus argument stand up to the data?
Well, it's interesting because Chomsky, I think this is correct. I could be sort of defaming Chomsky, but I don't think Chomsky ever did any child language observation himself. I don't think he did much corpus work either. So that would be looking at vast amounts of data of child language production. He sort of, Steven Pinker has called him, I think, an armchair theorist, and he kind of worked this out, I guess, sitting in his armchair and thinking about these things. It appears that when the data has been scrutinized, when the child language production data has been scrutinized, there isn't the evidence there for the poverty of the stimulus that Chomsky claims. So he says that there are certain constructions that children never hear, and yet they are able to produce, and that is evidence for a universal grammar. But if you look at the data, actually, children do get plenty of examples of those kind of constructions. So it seems like the poverty of the stimulus is a sort of really kind of flawed concept now that we have easier and better access to more and more data.
I just recently interviewed Cecilia Heyes, who's a British researcher in the field of evolutionary psychology, and she addressed this. In fact, she went into the evidence as a non-linguist. She was trying to figure out whether there was evidence that language is actually a cognitive instinct versus what she calls a cognitive gadget, which would mean something culturally acquired. She went in neutral. She didn't care which way it came out. In fact, she told me that she would have thought it was easier if it came out that he was right. She addressed in her book, it's called Cognitive Gadgets, another one of his arguments related to poverty of stimulus, which is the claim that children don't get sufficient feedback about their mistakes. And in particular, she refers to a study that he cited back in 1970 of this child named Youve. Are you familiar with that?
I don't think so, but go ahead.
But anyway, they had transcripts of this child talking to her parents, and he claimed that it showed that she didn't get any feedback. But her point was that in 1991, another researcher looked at the exact same transcripts and showed that she was getting corrected. And of course, now developmental psychologists have reams and reams of data about this. It's just people don't remember it. When your kid's learning how to talk, sure, you don't correct everything they say, but people don't remember.
You wouldn't necessarily need correction, right? Because if a child never hears it might be that the child assumes that not hearing a sentence modeled by the parent means that that sentence isn't used, and therefore, so they might produce something, they never hear a parent say anything similar, and they're like, okay, well, maybe I was wrong, and they don't use it again. I mean, there are forms of correction that are other than explicit correction, I think.
Right, like when the parent says, you meant XYZ, and basically rewords what you said into the right form. And the thing that Dr. Heyes pointed out was that universal grammar really kind of hangs on this poverty of stimulus argument. And once it's gone, what's left?
That was the impetus, I believe, for Chomsky's work, was that there's something missing from this account of language acquisition. What could that be? Well, it could be universal grammar. It could be this innate component. And that's why they made that appeal to that component, because otherwise how to explain the swiftness with which children acquire language. I'm just thinking, I think that I slightly misquoted Pinker. I think he said that Chomsky was a pencil and paper theorist, not that he was an armchair theorist. But you get the gist.
What other kinds of evidence do you think would support his theory? I mean, if we say, okay, poverty of stimulus doesn't work, what else would we need to explain that he says he explains?
I think it goes back to the question of sort of language similarity and language variation. A large part of what he was trying to do was to identify structures that are shared between all languages. And to do that while accounting for the variation, the thing that you kind of produce as being the underlying common structure gets less and less explanatory in a way. It becomes much more of a basic device that you would almost expect any form of communication to have. If there were structures that are robustly evidenced to be the same across all languages, that can't be sort of reduced to a very basic function, if there were really structures unique to language that were replicated again and again without counterexamples, that would be reasonably good evidence for a unique language module in the brain. If there were sort of unusual and baroque structures that were only found in human languages and they were found in all human languages, and if that was kind of pretty clear as soon as you started looking across languages, that could be quite good evidence for a universal grammar. But that doesn't appear to be the case either. Where Chomsky has got to now is that there's a very, very fundamental function which he believes universal grammar consists of now. And it's just recursion, or it's a form of recursion. The thing that you're talking about is so basic that it may, in fact, just be a function of thinking. It's not that explanatory to say that it's this one thing that all languages share if it's an incredibly basic thing.
I'm going to break in here to tell you about the upcoming release of the second edition of my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. Unfortunately, the current COVID-19 pandemic has created uncertainty, no pun intended, about the exact release date, but I'm hoping that it will come out in early May 2020. I'm planning a special live webinar for everyone who buys the book in the first 2 weeks. So if you want to keep informed, please go to brainsciencepodcast.com and sign up for the free newsletter. I'll tell you a little bit more in my closing remarks. That leads us into that whole issue of what used to be called a specific language impairment. I think you talked about this a little bit in your chapter. that the evidence is mounting that that's really not a language deficit. It's a sequential learning deficit. And I've also read that the FOXP2 gene, which has been hailed as, the language gene, there's lots of evidence now that that also has to do with sequential learning, not with language. In fact, some experimenters have put that gene, the human FOXP2 gene, into mice and discovered that they are able to learn better. So it's a sequential learning ability, which brings us back to the whole idea of recursion, because they seem connected. I was just talking to a German scientist about how our brains do numbers, and that we have to, in humans, learning to count involves that aha moment when you realize the n+1 idea, that the numbers are always going to go on and on. In a way, that's the same mental leap that we make when we figure out that a sentence could go on and on and on.
That suggests that these are general cognitive abilities and restricted to language, I think.
Why do you think Chomsky is so opposed to the idea that language evolved out of the communication abilities of other animals?
I think he would say that if that were the case, then there would be grades of linguistic ability amongst animals, and you would see more advanced communication skills among some animals and less advanced ones among others. And although, having just sort of articulated that, I think that is the case, isn't it? So I don't know what his thing about that is. I think that he feels that certainly that the animals who have been taught to communicate to use sign language or to imitate human speech and so on, he sort of doesn't believe that shows anything about their natural abilities. And that's just a question of, it's like teaching human beings the bee waggle dance. It's not illuminating, because their natural abilities and how they communicate naturally is the key. In a way, I'm tempted to kind of put it in a long line of human pride, if you like, about being the only ones who have language. It's a trope that you see throughout history and in myth making and so on. And it's a very difficult thing to shake off, that we are the ones who have been bestowed this ability. And that sets us apart from the animals in a kind of clean break way. Now, Chomsky's not stupid, and I think maybe it's to do him a disservice to sort of say that he's in that tradition. But it's striking how frequently through history, the fact that humans speak is, in myth and so on, really seen as the sine qua non of humanity. And it's absolutely what sets us apart. In lots of traditions, it's God gives human beings uniquely the ability to speak. So there's something very deeply ingrained about that idea.
Of course, I've been studying neuroscience for the last 15 years, or studying what other neuroscientists are doing. And the more and more they seem to be learning, the more and more it seems to be a matter of degree, not kind. For example, we've learned that birds are incredibly intelligent, even though they have entirely different brain structures from ours. So I think we got time to do at least one other myth. So why don't you pick your favorite?
Well, I tend to talk a lot about the myth of linguistic decline, which is, it's really prevalent. It comes up again and again. And I just did a radio phone-in actually with the Canadian radio this afternoon, and every single caller was adamant that language is in decline and that they've witnessed the degradation of standards and the corruption of language and so on. So that's it's a myth that maybe not that many very scientific people would subscribe to, but it's something that's enormously tenacious in the popular imagination. That's certainly one of the misconceptions that I've tried to tackle.
So if it's not declining, what is it doing?
It's a dynamical system. It's evolving. Language is not a fixed entity that is defined by the dictionary and is, there is a kind of Platonic version of the language that is defined by authority. It's something that happens in millions of instances of communication between millions of people. So it's necessarily fluid. Yes, there is a sort of agreed upon set of norms, But they're flexible, and language is noisy and has lots of redundancy. So there's lots of scope for mutation and change and exaptation, things being used, evolving for one purpose and being used for something else. So that's what language is. I mean, the evidence is just really clear that the things that we think of as standard now originated as sort of mutations or mistakes, if you like, in inverted commas, several hundred years ago.
As much as I love Shakespeare, I can't really actually understand a lot of what he writes. I mean, the average book on Shakespeare has all these little footnotes telling you what all the terms mean because the words have changed so much.
Yeah, of course. And there are interesting things that happen in linguistic evolution. Sound changes. One of the reasons that English spelling is like it is, which is quite quirky and difficult for non-English speakers to learn, is because English spelling did at one point accurately reflect the way that words were pronounced. But because spelling is quite conservative, whereas sound changes the whole time, we've now got this mismatch. So you have a word like night, as in, a dark night, and it would have been pronounced nicht. There you can see that the I actually represents the I sound, which is appropriate because it is not a diphthong like I. And then you have the GH sound, which is a kind of fricative, like a ch, so nicht. And actually GH reflects that pronunciation in spelling. Right now it looks ridiculous because the sounds have changed. And there are lots of examples of things like that. There are interesting examples of the way that words kind of are subject to these slight mutations and misapprehensions. And there's an interesting phenomenon called reanalysis, where the boundary between words is misinterpreted. I use misinterpreted again with kind of scare quotes because it's just interpreted differently. So, for example, you have a set of words like orange, apron, uncle, which actually an earlier stage in the language were norange, napron, and nuncle. But because those words often appeared with an indefinite article or a possessive, so you might say, give me my napron. It's indistinguishable there, whether you're saying napron or apron, because you're saying mine, M-I-N-E, or have you met my nuncle? Okay, so that word was nuncle, but it was reanalyzed. It was the word boundary was reinterpreted by a new generation of speakers or by a group of speakers that believed that perceived the N as being part of the first word. And that is a mistake, again, in inverted commas, that caught on and became the standard. So this is what's curious about when people take great issue with small changes in the language, changes in pronunciation, changes in the way words are being used, or the loss of phonemes, the loss of sounds, or the addition of sounds. It's kind of funny because, in 200 years, this could be the standard form and no one would dream of correcting you if you say orange juice. They don't say that, do you mean orange juice? So it's interesting the way that happens.
Beyond your book, what is the one thing about linguistics that you really would like us non-linguists to understand?
I think it would probably be that language is it's a cultural, I was going to say it's a natural phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon. It's something that we observe. It's not something which has sort of norms that are inviolable. Observing language is like observing a natural phenomenon, or it's like observing animal behavior. The things that are being said, the way people use language, that is what English is right now. There's this idea that there's a way language should be. People are very defensive about language. They can be very defensive about it. They can be very proprietorial about it. And they think, in general, there's a proper way to speak, a proper way to communicate. What people have a difficult time doing is putting themselves in the mind of a linguist who is a neutral observer of a human phenomenon and is recording what is being said and how communication is being conducted, and sort of writing down in their notebook, okay, well, this is how it is. This is how it is. A lot of people don't like the idea that what is produced by speakers is what language is. They have this kind of crystalline idea of how language should be in their minds. But, like anything, like an anthropologist observing customs or an ethologist observing animal behavior, those things are just evidence of the way the phenomenon works, right?
Right. You talked about in one of the chapters about dialects and the fact that to a certain extent we don't have conscious control over that sort of thing. And I remember when I was in my medical training, I had an attending physician who came from a small community, and he had a PhD, and, he talked like a PhD, but he would get in the room with a patient and he would talk like a country person. And I don't even think he realized he did it. He just automatically did that. And lots of us do that. We do that all the time if we move between communities.
Right, exactly. So he was talking to patients who were from the same community as him, right? I hear it with colleagues when they speak to someone on the phone from, their part of the world, and you can suddenly tell their accent gets a lot stronger. They are slipping back into a mode of speech that they had perhaps abandoned slightly because they're in London and, and they're not surrounded by people who speak the same dialect as them anymore. But you can hear them click back into it when they speak to someone on the phone from that part of the world.
And it's a shame that people act like there's something inferior about one person's versus another's. I mean, sure, you need to, if you're in an educated environment, you need to talk in a certain way. But to say that makes you a better person.
Well, better isn't really, it's not a scientific concept, is it?
Right.
I mean, there are varieties of language. There are varieties. There's nothing that the science can tell you about which variety is better than the other. That's a human thing about stigma and prestige. It's a cultural thing, I should say, rather, about stigma and prestige.
And it shows up in language because it shows up in almost all kinds of human activities.
Yeah, right. And language is an important way of signaling. When I talked about redundancy in language, strings of sounds can be quite complex, and there can be bits left over that can get adapted for social purposes, right? So if you say a word, like a Canadian from one part of the country can say a word one way, someone from another part of the country will say it slightly differently. The essence of the word is there, and there will be no miscommunication in terms of what the word means. But the little bits around the edges, maybe the height of the vowel or the character of the consonant, will signal certain social things. They'll say something about the geographical location where that this person grew up in. They might say something about their socioeconomic status. They might say something about their values. Do they value being seen as coming from a particular part of the country, or are they trying to avoid that association? There's an enormous amount in the redundancy that is used for social signaling.
And that sort of brings us back to what we were talking about earlier about the importance of language as a human activity. It's incredibly rich because there's more there than just, like you said, more than the meaning of the words.
Yeah, and I think that language is it's close to people's souls. It's an enormously powerful expression of identity, an in-group membership. It's not a coincidence, I think, that nationalism and linguistic divides often go together. Ethnic nationalism, ethnic conflict often take linguistic shape. And we've seen that, took place in the Balkans. It's active in India. Blood has been shed over language, no doubt about it.
Didn't you have an example in the book of two languages that were almost essentially the same, but got sort of labeled differently because of that?
A good example of that is Hindi and Urdu. And these are both languages of the Indian subcontinent. Hindi, written in a script derived from Sanskrit, is more closely associated with Hindus. And Urdu, which is written in a script derived from Arabic, is more associated with Muslims. For a long time, and still to a certain extent, those languages have been mutually intelligible or even really regarded as the same language. But because there's been this cultural pressure to separate them and make them more distinct, what you found is that scholars and, pundits and so on and ordinary people to a certain extent have started to incorporate more Sanskrit-derived words in their Hindi. And on the other hand, Urdu has been enriched with more Arabic-derived words. So actually the languages have been becoming more distinct, particularly in the sort of higher forms, which might be used for media, for radio or news reading. So that's an example of a sort of language that basically started out as one language, but became identified for sectarian reasons with two different groups. And now there's a force kind of pushing them apart, making them more distinct.
So, David, is there anything else you would like to share before we close?
What I've wanted is to sort of reel people in to the science of language with charming and curious examples. And I think my book contains a lot of that. And what it says to me is that there's a real hunger and an appetite for learning about language, but people don't necessarily know where to go, or they don't go beyond I never knew that the word treacle, which I'm not sure is even used in North America, right? I think treacle is what maybe you call molasses.
Okay, because, when I was reading that word in your book, I was like, what? I don't know what that word means.
That's a problem. That's something my US editor should have picked up on, but I've just realized it now. But so the word in Britain, and I suspect in Australia and New Zealand, treacle is the word we use for molasses. And it's a very common word. Everyone knows what it means. It actually derives from a word in Greek meaning wild beast. And I use this as an example of the etymological fallacy, which is why you can't rely on the origins of words for their true meaning. You'll often hear people say, this word really means XYZ because it comes from the Latin for da-da-da-da-da. But treacle is a good example of a word completely transmogrifying and becoming something totally different. The reason treacle is derived from this Greek word meaning wild beast is because a thick, sticky concoction of spices and, this syrupy substance was used as an antidote. It was used as a salve when people were bitten by a snake or some other kind of wild beast. And that's where we get the name from. That's not it's not a great example for a North American audience, but it's one of those curious facts about language that I hope is a way of reeling people into a slightly more thorough discussion of the mechanics behind linguistic change, behind the structure of language, all those kind of things.
So, David, are you working on another book, or was that enough for you? It's a lot of work, huh?
It's a lot of work, yeah, and I have a very busy day job. So I'm kind of incubating an idea for another book, but we'll see. We'll see how I get on. It might not be immediate.
Yeah, well, now you've got to do all the promotion for this one. So it sounds like you're getting opportunities to share it with other people, so that's good.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for that.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
You're really welcome. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
I want to thank David Shariatmadari for taking the time to talk with me about his book, Don't Believe a Word, The Surprising Truth About Language. Although this book focuses on scientific evidence, it is accessible to readers of all backgrounds. We focused on the long-standing debate over whether language is an instinct, but the book also includes many other topics. If you go to Amazon, I think you can see the table of contents to get a better sense of the book. And don't forget, you can get complete show notes for all episodes of Books and Ideas at booksandideas.com. Ever since I started my podcast, Brain Science, back in 2006, I've been fascinated by the debate about whether language is an instinct, especially since neuroscience has not uncovered anything resembling a language module in the human brain. For years, Chomsky's influence has seemed to overwhelm his apparent refusal to consider the actual evidence. I wanted to share this book because it addresses the poverty of stimulus argument that lies at the root of Chomsky's position. The key idea is that the poverty of stimulus argument doesn't stand up because there is now overwhelming data that babies get plenty of information to help them learn language. I will include links to some of the key papers in the show notes, and I have further references in the show notes for episode 168 of Brain Science with Cecilia Heyes. You can get that at brainsciencepodcast.com. We also talked briefly about the myth that language is declining versus the reality that languages are dynamic and constantly changing. We talked about how speech changes based on who we're talking to and the way people attach their cultural identity to certain dialects. We use the example of Hindi and Urdu on the Indian subcontinent. Don't Believe a Word, The Surprising Truth About Language by David Shariatmadari is available as an ebook, hardcover, and even audio, so I encourage you to check it out. I would love to hear your thoughts about this episode. You can send me email at docartemis@gmail.com. You can submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/docartemis. And you can also post to the Books and Ideas fan page on Facebook. The main thing I need to announce before I close is that Books and Ideas is going on a hiatus until November 2020. I made this decision before the COVID-19 pandemic because I'm working on a longer book about neuroscience that I hope to finish by the end of the year. The new expanded edition of my shorter book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, is in the layout stage and should be coming out in early May 2020. As I mentioned before, if you want to know when it is available, please sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter at brainsciencepodcast.com. I will also be publishing personal updates in the feed for Brain Science, so I encourage you to subscribe if you want to keep up with what I'm doing. I will continue to read widely and record interviews so that I can come back in full force in November. Please make sure you are subscribed to Books and Ideas in your favorite podcasting app, and I hope to talk to you again in November. Books and Ideas is copyright 2020 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at docartemis@gmail.com. Theme music for Books and Ideas is The Open Door by Beatnik Turtle. Please visit their website at beatnikturtle.com.